Hi, this is Mark, and welcome to Nerdology. And my very special guest today is Mr. Josh Zimon. Hey, Josh.
Hey, Mark. Thanks for inviting me on.
That's okay. How are you doing?
I'm doing great,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm very, very excited about today's podcast because you're talking about something near and dear to my heart. So,
Very much so, very much so. Just for the
yes,
uninitiated, if you don't know who Josh is, and if you don't, and why, he is a co-host for probably two of my favourite podcasts. So he's on Doctor Who, mostly Harmless, Cutaway, which is with Eric Escamilla, who we had on a few episodes back. And he's also a co-host on a show called The Memory Cheats, which is a bit of a hit on the old iTunes. Everyone I speak to loves that show. And you do that with Stephen, don't you? Stephen from Radio Free Skyro.
yes. It's funny because that particular podcast, which is essentially 15 minutes long, which
Mm-hmm.
I think that might be the reason why people love it so much,
Mm-hmm.
is it's really short. But we pick a randomly selected Doctor Who story from the classic series, and we just talk about our memories of it
And
for
very entertaining it is too.
for 15 minutes. So there you go.
Yeah, I'd struggle to do that for 60 seconds, let alone 15 minutes. So you're doing very well.
it's a
And,
lot of fun.
and the other show you do with Eric is Prognosis Negative, and you do this whole series of commentaries called Shaken Not Stirred, commentaries on Bond films, which are very,
Yes,
very entertaining. They sound like a
yes.
lot of fun to make.
They really are. Commentaries are a lot of fun to do, and my knowledge of James Bond is kind of weak, and it was weak for the longest time. But when we all kind of got together and said, "Hey, let's do this. Let's watch all the James Bond movies,
Hmm.
and just do a commentary on each one, and let's do it randomly. Let's not, do them in order." It was a really great idea, and everybody has sort of a different level of knowledge about the movie.
Hmm.
Steven hasn't even seen any of them.
Yeah, that's one of the entertaining things for me, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, it's really a lot of fun, and I enjoy doing that, and it's a good group of guys too.
Okay, so if you're still listening to this now, switch off the podcast, go and check out Josh's shows. They're much, much better.
Stop,
So
stop.
I kind of got you along to talk about Sherlock Holmes.
Yes. So what's really funny is like I've alluded to my love for Sherlock Holmes on mostly Harmless Cutaway, but
Hmm.
actually, before there was Doctor Who in my life, there was Sherlock Holmes in my life.
Yeah.
So, and it's, I mean, it sort of makes sense. And if you look around fandom, it's not uncommon for Sherlock Holmes and for the Venn diagram, if you will,
Yeah.
between the Sherlock Holmes fans and the Doctor Who fans to be in the same boat.
Hmm.
There's a lot of fans of both, probably for obvious reasons, right?
Yeah.
I mean, all Doctor Who really is, in many ways, is kind of Sherlock Holmes in time and space.
Pretty much. They do share a lot of similarities.
They do, and at least from the classic series, anyway, right?
Mm,
Because
yeah.
Sherlock Holmes was non-sexual, should we call him?
Yeah.
There wasn't any women in Sherlock Holmes's life, much like there weren't any women in the Doctor Who's life.
Hmm.
In fact, he was. You could argue, and I did actually in some paper
Hmm.
when I was young, that he was a misogynist. That Sherlock Holmes did not like women at all.
Hmm.
There were several quotes within the literature that indicate, that women, uh, arsenic, a smile and then an arsenic in the soup, kind of,
Hmm.
um, uh, that women were out there to make men do things and so on, and he really had a very difficult time with women and didn't really like women that much. So
We can even be quite dismissive of his friends, can't he? Because he sometimes gives Watson a bit of a hard time.
yeah, what's interesting is um, I think later in the movies, the particularly the Basil Rathbones,
Hmm.
there's a lot of making fun of Watson, and I think that when those movies came out, I think a lot of movie makers thought that that's how that relationship went, is that Holmes just kept this bumbling idiot around with him all the
Yeah.
time. But the literature doesn't pull that off the same way. The literature pulls it more off like Watson is brilliant. He's a very brilliant guy.
Yeah.
It sort of makes more sense from a realistic standpoint that why would Holmes hang out with a bumbling idiot?
Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
Why wouldn't he hang out with somebody who is close to his intelligence?
Hmm.
He would get bored so easily with somebody if they were in any way, shape, or form a bumbling idiot. But that's the kind of format that sort of worked in the 40s, but
Yeah.
but the literature doesn't bear it off, Mark. It doesn't. Watson is much more intelligent in the literature, and much more intelligent when you see it on screen as it's been written in the literature by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
It almost feels like Holmes is kind of training him in his ways, and it's almost like he's his kind of student, if you like.
Oh, definitely. But I mean, you know what? At the end of the day, the way Watson balances off Holmes isn't the intelligence factor. It's just he's got different skills, and his flaws are different than Sherlock Holmes's flaws. Sherlock Holmes's flaws, we just started talking about, was his misogyny, his drug use, his inability to sort of manage some social situations.
Yeah.
And the Watson's sort of the opposite. He's much more sociable and much more he's a writer. I mean, he enjoys writing. He enjoys he's more of a people person, quotation fingers, if you will.
The books are told through his eyes, aren't they? From his journals.
Right, exactly. So what Holmes found in a friend is somebody who could mitigate his flaws to a large degree, at least when you're looking at the literature, and you feel like their friendship is real and it isn't contrived, which you sort of do when you look at those 40s Sherlock Holmes. Now don't get me wrong. I love the Basil Rathbone Nigel Bruce series. I love it. I've watched those movies more times than I've watched Doctor Who shows. I mean,
that's a lot of times.
It is. I could actually do a memory cheats on all 14 Basil Rathbone, Nigel Bruce, Sherlock Holmes.
Well, Josh, for the next 15 minutes, you're going to be talking. No, we won't do that to
you. I could. That's the scary thing.
Do you think there might be a case for saying that Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the books, possibly because he based it on the character of Holmes on Dr. Joseph Bell, who he worked with, and I'm wondering whether there's some kind of, maybe it's very easy to jump to this conclusion that perhaps Conan Doyle was very much the Watson figure and Bell was the Holmes figure, and he's kind of using that as a template for these adventures, maybe.
I think that's as good an answer as I've ever heard on that, because I think you're right. I think it's very similar to that. I think it's interesting because Conan Doyle made Dr. Watson a doctor, okay, and Sherlock Holmes wasn't a doctor. But the fact of the matter is, when you're looking at deductive reasoning overall and how deductive reasoning functions, at least doctors in those days and doctors in the early 20th century, you don't really have the capabilities of trying to figure out how people, what's ailing somebody.
And you didn't have sort of ultra scans and that sort of thing.
Right, and that was the whole idea that Joseph Bell was teaching, was being able to take the smallest items that you see or the smallest things said and be able to take that and extrapolate it into a story. Now with Sherlock Holmes, it's fiction. Okay, let's be clear, it's fiction. People can't really do this, but to a large extent, this is what doctors need to do, is they need to take small pieces of information and extrapolate it into big to understand diagnoses and to diagnose. I remember my father, by the way, is a doctor. And for years, I remember listening to him on call. When he was on call, he would have to get on the phone with a patient and talk to the patient and ask the patient pointed questions about what's kind of going on. And one of my father's really great abilities was to be able to diagnose over the phone.
That's pretty impressive.
It was, so I think that, from that standpoint, it really does start. This idea, this deductive reasoning idea, kind of starts from the amount of medicine people knew back in those days. Because we have technology today where, I don't know about your doctor, but my doctor has a laptop sitting in front of him.
Yeah.
He's got a BlackBerry. He's looking stuff up. He's doing, they didn't have that back in those days. So they had to work with what they knew.
Yeah.
So I have the genesis of the Sherlock Holmes methodology comes from medicine, pure and simple, as a method, and all it does is transfer that method into a consulting detective around crime.
Yeah.
So it's brilliant. From
That's
that
one of the things I find really entertaining. I just in a process of doing a little bit of research into this before we decided to record. You recommended a few stories, and one of them was the Blue Carbuncle.
Yes.
And the way he looks at a hat and can deduce from just the most tiny little piece of evidence that this guy is a particular age, his social standing, the fact that he's gone from being quite a well-off person to being someone who's not so well-off anymore. It's really entertaining. It's really just makes for great reading.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I also brought up the speckled band because the speckled band, and for my money, if your audience has never seen a Jeremy Brett Sherlock Holmes and wants to start somewhere, start with the speckled band.
Yeah.
It's in the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes because it's spine tingling.
I watched it yesterday.
So there's a scene where he goes and he's literally on the floor and he's going through this. All he's looking at is this room.
Yeah.
Okay, it's a room like any other, Mark. Right? He's going through it. He makes his deductions. He doesn't tell the audience what his deductions are. Some things he says, some things he doesn't. There's like a bell rope coming out of the grill at the top, the ventilator.
There's a saucer of milk.
There's a saucer of milk in the other room. There's a saucer of milk in the other room. There's a safe in there, right? There's so there's a bed clamped to the floor.
Yeah.
Okay. There's stuff like that. So when we hear the exposition of this, Holmes and Watson are sitting in this this weird hut that has visibility into this bedroom for this very old house. And he's telling Watson about this, and he says something like, the bed, we're about to, I have reservations bringing you in tonight, Watson. Something like of that nature.
Yeah.
And he's like, well, why? It's because we're about to get into something that's very, very dangerous. And he starts describing the room. We have a ventilator. We have a bell rope attached. We have a bed. A woman sleeps. We have the bed. And he's like, well, what's the big deal? He said, it's about the bed, Watson. It was clamped to the floor. It couldn't be moved. And it's like, that's so spine tingling when he says that. Do you remember that, Mark? Like,
yeah.
I mean, the music comes in and they do all the good drama stuff too, but and Jeremy Brett just plays this absolutely perfectly.
I mean, we talked about Rathbone before. He was, I think, probably for a lot of people, maybe of our generation, he was maybe the first on-screen Holmes that most people would have seen. And he was kind of the archetypal Holmes for a lot of people. But for me, having seen the Jeremy Brett interpretation, I think that is Sherlock Holmes to a T. I think he's absolutely amazing, spellbinding to watch on the screen. Without
a doubt. I cannot disagree with you there. And I'm by the way, I'm bringing in everything that's happened ever since. Okay. Because the Jeremy Brett series came out in the mid 80s and stretched to about 1992 or 93 or something like that. And he's the archetypal Holmes. But the other piece of it is that with the Jeremy Brett series, Mark, get out your literature, okay? get out your literature for the early ones.
Yeah.
You'll find that the dialogue is exactly the same in the book.
Well, he was obsessive about making it as close as possible to the source material. He would spend all of his spare time reading the novels to make sure it was absolutely 100% accurate.
And you know what? It was dead on close. I mean, some things you can't do, but
Yeah.
like, it's really, really close to the way the literature was.
Mm-hmm.
Which makes it, it for a modern audience. Listen, and I might be just speaking as an American here, but we don't sit and read books. Not a lot of people read books anymore. They're doing a lot of watching. They're doing a lot of stuff on the computer.
Mm-hmm.
If you're gonna read something, it better be a short paragraph, right? We just don't have the patience I'm speaking for a lot of people here. I'm sure your listeners are avid readers.
I have to say my own personal attention span has become really awful as years have gone on. Something like a short story can quite grab me, but if I'm going to sit and read a novel, it's got to be something that really gets my interest and
Absolutely.
to get me to stick with it.
Absolutely, without a doubt. So I'm sort of in your boat. I'm exactly the same in that vein. It's got to really grab me. So the great news is that the Brett series really did grab a new audience for the really original Arthur Conan Doyle Holmes. And people started to really truly appreciate what it was all about because his stories are really brilliant.
Yeah.
And you would think, the Basil Rathbone series, that stuff was just, they took one element from one story and then built an entire story that had nothing to do with Conan Doyle around it.
I mean, the very early ones were relatively faithful to the novels. Things like Hound of the Baskervilles was, fairly nuts and bolts a Conan Doyle story, but certainly as you go through that series of films, particularly at the time they were made, there's the whole thing of taking Holmes and Watson from their era and putting them into the 1940s, and they became very kind of almost like public information films, kind of trying to boost morale because of the whole World War II going on at the time.
Wait a minute. Taking Holmes and putting him into a modern day?
Who would do that? That would never happen.
That would never happen again,
That's craziness.
Right? So, and it was a brilliant idea then, and it's a brilliant idea now.
Yeah.
But you're right. But so the first two films, if we're gonna go to Basil Rathbone now. This is I'm gonna bore you now. Okay, you ready?
Okay, yeah, I'm just getting my pillow ready.
So the first two films, you're right. Adventures of Sherlock Holmes and Hound of the Baskervilles. Actually, Hound of the Baskervilles came first, and then Adventures. Were 20th Century Fox.
Yes.
They were close. They weren't completely on this, but the stories were similar.
Yeah.
To the Arthur Conan Doyle's, but Adventures of Sherlock Holmes was not. That was not really. It's kind of more like the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes was the play that was done by I don't remember his name. I'm gonna go look him up because I'm not in the memory cheats. But it was a film of the play that was built but a play that was created by somebody, and it wasn't a Conan Doyle at all.
Right.
It was just based off the play. And then, so then they dropped the film series, okay? And at the same time, Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce got pulled onto radio.
That's right. Yeah, I read that.
In the 1940 timeframe.
Didn't they do over 200 shows of that?
They did. They actually, I don't know if they did over 200 shows. I know that Basil Rathbone, in 1946, when he stopped doing the movies, he stopped doing the radio plays too. Yeah. And somebody else came in and did Sherlock Holmes on the radio with Nigel Bruce, believe it or not. But the radio shows had such popularity. Yeah. That a new movie company came in, Fox. I think it was Fox.
Universal.
Universal, sorry. Yeah. Universal comes in. And they say, okay, we're gonna do Sherlock Holmes, but we're gonna do it in modern day. And because you're right, they became this. As a matter of fact, if you have the full versions of these movies, you'll find that at the beginning they're like buy war bonds and stuff like that. Yeah. And they're not long. They're like 75 minutes. But it does really bring Holmes into the. I mean, he's using a phone. He's not in a horse-drawn carriage. He's in a car,
Yeah.
and he comes to the United States for one.
Yeah, I watched it today, actually, Sherlock Holmes in Washington,
Yes,
which is
and
quite a fun movie.
it is. They're well. They're all. I think they're all fun.
Hmm.
The voice of terror. Okay, so 42. It was the voice of terror.
Mm-hmm.
42 was an interesting year because they did the voice of terror, the secret weapon, and then they kind of moved off the war a little bit.
Yeah.
But those two were very very war centric. Voice of terror and secret weapon.
Mm-hmm.
And they made Moriarty into a traitor, essentially.
Yeah. Well, that's another thing that I've found quite surprising, being perhaps not so steeped in Sherlock Holmes, particularly the books. Moriarty is kind of thought of as this huge figure within the literature from people perhaps coming to it new, whereas he's actually only in 2 of the books.
That's right. There's discussion, there's allusions to Moriarty later and before.
Yeah.
That Moriarty had this incredible crime syndicate that included so many different people that even after his death, at the end of the final problem, there was still, and I hate to do spoilers for The Empty House, which is the story that ended up after the final problem. And I guess we can talk about why the final problem ever existed because Conan Doyle would kill him off.
I think he just got tired of writing it, didn't he?
He got tired of writing it, but it's like, this thing is it's such a huge moneymaker. I don't understand why he decided to do that. But he decided to concentrate on his field and stream writing, his outdoors stuff. It's the weirdest thing. In fact, there's a novel after that final problem, he wrote a complete novel on fishing.
Yeah.
That probably had 5 people buy it. He just wanted to write what he wanted to write.
Yeah.
But anyway, The Empty House has Colonel Sebastian Moran. I'm switching back now. This is what I do, Mark. I'm sorry.
That's all right. We go off on tangents all over the place on this show.
So Colonel Sebastian Moran is the one who supposedly was an assassin for Sherlock Holmes. That's long, and he was an associate of Moriarty's.
Yeah.
So there's always this allusion to Moriarty as you go through, and eventually it kind of dies off. But you're right. I mean, people think of Sherlock Holmes, they think of Moriarty as his equal and so on. And in fact, in the 70s Doctor Who, they built a Moriarty for Doctor Who's John Proby's Sherlock Holmes in the version of the Master.
Yeah.
But you're right. It's a very small piece of the oeuvre, if you will.
Yeah.
It's not a large piece of it, but it's what people remember. It's kind of like Elementary, My Dear Watson, which he never ever says.
I think he says elementary, doesn't he? But I don't think he ever says Elementary, My Dear Watson.
He never does in the literature, right? He never does. But I mean, it's like one of those things that people just remember about him. They remember the pipe, the calabash, and they remember the deerstalker hat.
Yeah, I mean, he wears that once, I think, or maybe a few times, but not every story.
No, not by any stretch. And it's funny because when I started watching the Basil Rathbones, I started getting annoyed by his strange hairstyle that he had in those 1943 stories. With that weird curly head.
Yeah. I was thinking that when I was watching it today.
Yeah, I mean, it's just very, very strange. And I mean, they made it better later, no doubt. But there's only one allusion. It's funny because there's only one allusion to the deerstalker in Sherlock Holmes in the Basil Rathbones, and that's in the Adventures when he's about to leave the flat and he grabs the deerstalker hat, and Watson said, "You promised," and he puts it back and he takes the top hat with him. It's kind of like an allusion towards, we're not doing the old stuff, we're doing the new stuff. Yeah, brilliant.
Going back to Jeremy Brett, I think possibly what made him such a perfect fit was, I always get the impression, I don't know if it's stated specifically, that Holmes maybe has this kind of personality where it's mentioned that when he doesn't have a case, becomes very depressed.
Mm-hmm.
And then when he's working, he's almost like he's really, kind of bouncing off the walls. He's really into it in a big way, almost kind of like he's possibly bipolar. And I think Jeremy Brett, from what I understand, had similar issues going on. So it's almost
he did.
like it was kind of custom made for that role.
He was. I mean, in real life, Jeremy Brett had major psychological and mental issues. And that's well documented, by the way. I mean, it's well documented, and before he died, actually, he came out and talked about it. A very interesting guy, a very brilliant actor. But you're right. I mean, he was sort of tailor made for this role because it's often talked about in the literature, and it's alluded to some degree, about how Holmes gets bored very, very easily. And has to use drugs in order to quell that boredom. But when he's on a case, he's very single-minded on the case, and that's what he's thinking about all the time. So there is definitely mental illness here. There's no doubt. I mean, there's discussions of possibly an Asperger's kind of. I mean that where it's sort of a form of autism where he has these very, very targeted and knows so much and is able to visualize. He's like kind of like the Rain Man, if you will.
Yeah,
okay,
you've got that sort of social awkwardness that comes in.
Right, and but on top of that, he has these superhuman kind of skills, which makes it actually kind of real, because these people actually exist where they have this this autism where they are piano virtuosos, but can't really can't pour a cup of tea, type. And you'll have to excuse me because I'm not a doctor. I don't know what that type of autism is, but it brings it a little bit into reality. Is that Holmes has this issue where it gives him this sort of superhuman kind of skill, but he doesn't have the social ability to kind of manage it. He can't manage it. So when he's not in a situation where he's on a case, he just doesn't know what to do with himself. And there are points in time where it discusses, like he does an analysis of 150 types of tobacco. I mean, it's just because it kept his brain moving, and if his brain stopped moving, he got really depressed and really upset and bored and suicidal, like really kind of serious feelings. In any case, it's just part of his character, no doubt. So
I was reading up on Jeremy Brett, and admittedly this is from the internet, so I don't know how accurate this is, but where I was reading this piece that said that he was one of the few actors that's actually played Watson and Holmes. Apparently he played Watson in a stage version in LA in 1980. Who do you think his opposite number was as Sherlock Holmes? Who do you think is a sort of a likely candidate?
Let's see. So you said stage play in LA?
Yeah. So let's just take it as read that it's not an English actor.
Okay. So maybe like Christopher Lee or something like that?
Ah, he's English.
Oh. I don't know. You got me.
Charlton Heston.
Charlton Heston.
Can you imagine that?
No. Actually, I can't.
I know Holmes does
talking.
carry weapons, but I can't imagine a situation where he's going around with rifles taking people out. I don't know.
No, I might have mentioned Christopher Lee because Christopher Lee played Mycroft Holmes in the 1970 Private Life of Sherlock Holmes with Robert Stevens playing, and he also played Holmes himself in some German movie. And I know. I mean, he seems like he'd play a good Holmes, right?
I think so.
Christopher Lee. He's kind of got the right stature, the right demeanor for Holmes.
Yeah,
surprised he didn't play more. Peter Cushing actually
I was
played
going to say,
Sherlock
yeah, Peter
Holmes.
Cushing played him in the 70s, didn't he?
Yes. So Peter Cushing is like Tom Baker, somebody who has played Doctor Who, if you will, and Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
And of course, Tom Baker
Yes.
played Sherlock Holmes, what he calls his failed attempt at Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah, I think he's possibly a bit hard on himself, but
I think he was very hard on himself.
yeah.
I thought it was somewhat decent. Actually, Caroline John was in that.
Yeah. Was that the first job he had after Doctor Who? I can't remember now. Pretty
I
sure it
don't
was.
know. Possibly. It was 1981 or 1982. So hopefully he worked before before that, because it didn't come out until 82, I believe. Yeah. I mean, I thought he was rather a good Holmes, actually.
Well, he's got that certain characteristic about him, that kind of how can I put this delicately? He's slightly eccentric.
Yep, he is. And I mean, listen, Talons of Wing Chiang and Doctor Who
Yeah.
was essentially a Sherlock Holmes story.
Has a perfect Doctor Who story.
Yeah, and he played it off very much like Holmes, and in fact, he had a lot of Holmes isms in that story. It's not just the deerstalker cap that he wore, but sleep is for tortoises and all that other nonsense is very Sherlock Holmes, and that was written like a Sherlock Holmes was written. So that's why a lot of fans of both really truly enjoy both of those things.
Yeah.
At the same time.
I mean, with going slightly back to the literature again for a while, it does introduce. I don't know if it's one of the earlier kind of uses of it. He was an exponent of martial arts way before Bruce Lee. I mean, that's kind of unusual, certainly for the time period.
Yeah, actually, there's a lot of he was sort of James Bond before James Bond was James Bond too.
Yeah.
He took to disguises. He was a brilliant actor on his own. He was able to disguise himself very, very well. They did this a little bit in the Basil Rathbones, but I mean, it was so clearly in disguise in those.
Yeah.
But in the Jeremy Brett, I mean, he plays off extremely well as this as a beggar on the street or somebody in an opium den or something of that nature. There's also talk about like his cane. He actually had a cane that had a knife at the end.
Yeah.
And some brandy at the top. And I mean, he liked some of these gadgets, which kind of brings me into the James Bond piece.
Yeah.
And he had a lot of these facets that made him able to manage these cases. He took it upon himself to manage each case very, very differently. Sometimes he'd actually go in and become somebody who was around. The Man with the Crooked Lip is the one that comes to mind, that he had to actually become a person like this person in order to understand his motivation.
Kind of like a method actor.
Kind of like a method actor. And all a method actor really is somebody who needs to understand the mindset of somebody in order to play the role. And that's the way Sherlock Holmes looked at detection, is he had to really kind of get in somebody's mind to understand how they operate, because he could make it predictable. So he took the human aspect of being unpredictable and made it predictable by understanding what they were like.
I think if you ask a lot of people who perhaps aren't that well versed in the world of Sherlock Holmes to name a Sherlock Holmes story, I think, just off the top of my head, I would think the majority of people would probably say The Hound of the Baskervilles.
Yes.
Now, what is quite striking to me is he's barely in it. For a large section of that story, he's not even involved. It's all Watson, which is quite interesting, I think.
Yeah, and I think that Hound of the Baskervilles is well known, no doubt. But I mean, it's by no means the best story ever created. It's very interesting how that one gets a lot of press, if you will.
Yeah.
But the scene of him and the Deerstalker really sort of comes from that Hound of the
Yeah.
Baskervilles story. Also, interestingly enough, like the first story, which was A Scandal in Bohemia,
Yeah.
the first short story, right? The first one in the Strand was a story where Holmes failed. I mean, he was bested by Irene Adler in
So that's
that
where they got the
story.
idea in Rocky to get him to lose the first one, and then they could do a follow on.
It's interesting because when you're trying to set up your hero, you almost want him to win.
Yeah.
And again, you know, I mean, I believe he had novels before he had the short stories. But at the same time, when you're trying to introduce a new audience,
Yeah.
introducing by showing how he failed,
That's an interesting way of doing it.
it is. It is an interesting way of doing it. And again, I mean, that whole idea around, you know, how do you get somebody to be predictable? There are certain things that are commonalities among human beings that he actually studies and understands. So when he put off the smoke bomb in that house, he knew that she would look at where that thing was hidden, where that picture was hidden. And it's just, and it's, even if you have the most brilliant adversary, they're human and they're going to make mistakes because they're human. And if you have that understanding of the way humans operate, you will best them because they can't help but
It's like a tell in poker, isn't it?
but give themselves up. Yes. It's like a tell in poker, no doubt. Holmes would have been a great poker player.
Yeah, I'm sure. So you mentioned Scandal in Bohemia, which they kind of gave a new twist to in Sherlock, the Stephen Moffat version, which was A Scandal in Belgravia, which is an area of London. And I think Irene Adler's quite different in this take compared to how she is in the book.
She is. Actually, I enjoyed A Scandal in Belgravia much more than I enjoyed the original story. A Scandal in Belgravia was brilliantly done, and it did bring the Moriarty piece into it as well.
Yeah.
I thought that was absolutely brilliant the way they put that together. I mean, and they used the modern technology in order, the cell phone, and everything about the cell phone was important.
I really like that. The way they used it as well, just the idea of superimposing the text on the screen, I thought was just a really neat sort of shortcut to kind of get the plot moving. And also just little things like Watson now having a blog rather than writing a journal. It's the obvious thing, isn't it?
Isn't it? Yeah. And I liked how in this particular story they actually started talking about some of his cases.
Yeah.
And how, you know, they changed the name just slightly.
Yeah.
From the Arthur Conan Doyle ones. And it's funny because that's the great thing about Stephen Moffat, and what I like about him in Who also is that he does like love to kiss the fans a little bit, you know. Excuse my phone.
That's okay.
I love the fact that he loved to do a little thing that the fans would appreciate.
Yeah.
But wasn't really all that important for the story necessarily.
Yeah, it's like a little nod to the fans.
Absolutely.
So it won't affect your enjoyment of the story, but it's just something that if you're well versed in it, you pick up and think, oh yeah, he's talking to me.
And that's the great thing about it is, I mean, Stephen Moffat actually, you know, is in two of my favorite franchises, if not two of my absolute favorite franchises, and he really gets it.
Yeah,
he totally gets it. So the new Sherlock actually is the closest to attempting to bring the idea of Holmes into the modern world, and he's got it perfectly. He's got the type of characters perfectly. He did a great job. I'm giving Moffat all the credit, but it was a lot of different people with Sue Virtue and Mark Gatiss and a bunch of other people too.
That's
but
right.
The Martin Freeman and Benedict Cumberbatch combination is a stroke of brilliance.
Yeah.
It's very much like that friendship. It feels very close to that friendship that was in the literature.
Mm-hmm.
And Watson is so loyal as a friend,
Mm-hmm.
and that comes off in the literature, and here it comes off also how loyal he is to as a friend, even though he knows that Holmes is just this whacked out guy.
Yeah.
He still stands by him, right?
Yeah. I think I'm right in saying when they first meet in the novels, Watson was serving in the army in Afghanistan.
Yep.
And it just goes to show how little things change, because in the modern day version, there's still a war going on, albeit a different one in Afghanistan, and he's been sent home.
It's definitely a clever parallel between the two, no doubt. And I think that they did a lot of that in creating Sherlock. There are a lot of clever parallels between the two. And the other thing about, well, they met through a mutual friend, right? In literature, right? And they both needed a place to stay. And in this case, Holmes needed a roommate. It's unknown why he needed a roommate, but everybody has a different idea of the reason why that sort of happened. But we know that Watson didn't really have a job. I mean, he just came from the war, and he had no one, and he needed a place to stay, so he stayed with and became this man's best friend, and it's interesting because what Holmes really needed was somebody who was like a doctor.
Yeah.
So, and that's a parallel between the two as well.
I don't know if you're aware of there's a show in the States called Elementary.
Yes.
Have you seen any?
Yes, I have. And
they take that to another level, don't they? Because he's like a recovering addict, and Watson, in this case, I think he's played by Lucy Liu, is kind of like his therapist almost.
His what's the word? Not therapist, but her job is to sort of stay with him and make sure he stays off drugs.
Yeah.
And she calls him his client.
Yeah.
Her client. If you take Elementary as just simply as a drama with a good idea, and you kind of take it out of the Holmes, the real Sherlock Holmes meme, it's really enjoyable.
Yeah, I think it makes for a good detective story, but it's not Holmes.
It's not Holmes, and I mean, so it's okay, and I like it, and I do watch it and enjoy it. But if I enjoy it as I don't enjoy it as a Holmes fan. I enjoy it more as a drama fan and a fan of that type of genre versus making it into something that's Holmes, because it would annoy you if you're watching it to look for Sherlock Holmes. A lot of things would annoy you a lot.
Yeah.
So I kind of take myself out of that a little bit and watch it as it is. It's not like the BBC Sherlock, which is much closer to what you would expect modern day Holmes to be like.
Yeah. I think they take more care to try and weave in things from the original source material, whereas I get the impression from the one or two that I've seen of Elementary, they're just kind of going off with taking that core idea and then just having completely new stories.
Absolutely, and I think the character on his own, I don't think Sherlock Holmes could have ever been an addict of anything, quite honestly, because Sherlock Holmes was an addict of his cases. He could have dropped everything else if he had just simply had cases going 24 hours a day. He never would have turned to drugs. He never would have turned to anything else.
Yeah.
He wasn't an addict. He was sort of a psychological disaster when it came to that kind of thing. It's not in his. He wasn't as we would portray a human being. He was very off. I don't believe he would have been an addict. Although Watson did worry about him. I mean, and his usage of cocaine, his usage of morphine and other drugs. But he never needed it when he was on a case.
So if you had to try and convert someone who's never read a Holmes, never seen any of the Jeremy Brett programs, any of the Rathbone movies, what would you choose as your introductory story to try and get them hooked?
So when you say introductory story,
Hmm.
do you mean like if I wasn't going to make them go watch Sherlock, which is the first thing I'd make anybody watch if they've
Hmm.
never seen anything with Holmes, I really would make them watch Sherlock because
Okay.
it would. And I'll get to literature in a second
Hmm.
because I think it's great drama. It also tells the stories like a Holmes story would be told.
Yeah.
And it will keep you involved the entire 90 minutes or whatever it is that those are on. As far as the literature is concerned,
Hmm.
I brought up the Speckled Band earlier.
Yeah.
The Speckled Band to me shows Sherlock Holmes at its very foundation
Hmm.
of what it really is. You've got, and it's sort of cookie cutter, if you will, to some degree. You've got a woman that comes in, she's afraid, she feels like she's gonna get killed.
Hmm.
You got you have Holmes going and doing all of his deductions on a room or a pair of rooms,
Hmm.
and then you have Holmes solving the problem and also saving the woman at the same time. I've just told the story. There you go.
That's okay. You don't need to read it now, folks. That's it.
No, but it's really brilliantly done.
Yeah.
And there are some pieces in there where you're like, oh, maybe it's this or maybe it's that.
Hmm.
And once the story is told, you realize how brilliant he is and
Yeah.
how he deduced everything, because nothing is really clear.
There's all these little
It,
pieces of information that come through, and it's almost like misdirection. You're kind of trying to second guess how it's going to turn out, but he's very clever in the way that he plots it.
No doubt about it. And there are many in that first year, if you will, that Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, the Bruce Partington plans is very
Hmm.
good as well. The Solitary Cyclist,
Hmm.
those those really portray Holmes in the way that I remember getting really interested in Holmes.
Hmm.
So if I were to start with some of the literature, I would really start with that first book, the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes.
Hmm.
The Return is more like which is the next set of short stories, The Return
Yeah.
of Sherlock Holmes. It kind of delves into other areas, and it's still very good, by the way. And
Hmm.
as a Holmes fan, I really enjoy most of what's in The Return.
Yeah.
But if you want to get up and running on who Holmes is, I would definitely, believe it or not, I'd start at the beginning. I would
Okay.
say it's funny because I wouldn't say that about Doctor Who. I wouldn't at all. I would say start in the middle somewhere,
You
and then
mean
go
4
back.
episodes with cavemen talking about making fire? That's great TV. I have to say the first episode is awesome. I love the
Oh
first
yeah,
episode of Unearthly Child. It's amazing.
I agree. But I mean, if I were to start my 13-year-old daughter on it,
Mm.
I think I might start with something in the new series,
Hmm.
or like I would start somebody on Sherlock.
Yeah.
I would start somebody on the BBC version of Sherlock,
Hmm.
and then bring them back to the original.
Yeah, I think
Um,
that's a fair comment.
and then the Jeremy Bretts,
Mm.
because I think the Jeremy Bretts actually are the literature in moving pictures,
Yeah.
and there's much value in seeing the stuff that Conan Doyle actually, it was all Conan Doyle's ideas and
Hmm.
not just a piece of his ideas
Yeah.
extrapolated into something that's a lot more for a wider audience.
I think they took a lot of care to make them as close as they possibly could and try and capture that essence that's in the books. And I think they've done a great job.
It's brilliant.
Mm.
It's absolutely brilliant.
I don't know if you've read it, but there's a book by an author called Anthony Horowitz. It's called The House of Silk.
No.
It's awesome. I mean, I'm nowhere near as versed in Holmes as you are, but this was sanctioned by the Conan Doyle estate or whoever looks after that sort of property. So this was an official book. I have the audio book, and it's read by Derek Jacobi, and it is brilliant, absolutely superb. Really captured that spirit.
I'll have to check that out.
It's
Yeah, I
very,
mean,
very good.
what's really funny is we've been talking about Holmes for about an hour,
Hmm.
and we haven't even scratched the surface. I mean,
No.
there's just so much out there,
Hmm.
and there are so many movies, and there's television shows, and there's short stories, and there's stuff that people have written on for a modern audience that's in novels that supposedly are Sherlock Holmes based. And I mean, we can't even scratch the surface on this.
Hmm.
there's just so much out there. I just think that if you get really interested in it, you're never going to run out of material.
That's a great thing
This
about it, isn't it?
You're really not. And again, I mean, the original material, you're looking at 4 novels and 56 short stories.
Hmm.
Okay, to get through that alone will take you a while. Actually, in high school, when I was in high school, back
Hmm.
about 5,000 years ago, um, I actually did my senior research paper on Sherlock Holmes
Oh wow.
and read all 56 short stories and all 4 novels as a result.
Hmm.
And I built this long-standing essay on who Sherlock Holmes was and his. I wonder where that is. I should go look for that. Maybe I burned it somewhere. I don't know. But imagine doing something in high school that you love to do,
Yeah, that's
and
awesome.
and putting it all together into something like that, and actually making that work for you. It's something I was interested in as a kid.
Hmm.
My father introduced me to the Basil Rathbone Sherlock Holmes movies when I was 10,
Hmm.
something like that. And that's kind of what we did. Like on weekend nights, we would sit and watch them, and we'd watch them out of order, and we'd watch them over and over and over again and talk about them over and over and over again.
So there's another similarity with Doctor Who. It's great family viewing.
It really is, and it's just the way. I mean, it's the way I really got close to my dad, and
Hmm.
those movies are so fun. And there's only 14 of them, but we went over them over and over and over again. He loved them that much as I did.
So you never get bored of them.
I don't get bored of them. I watch them from time to time today.
Hmm.
Sometimes late at night when there's nothing on TV. The best time to watch a black and white film, in my view, is
Yeah,
late at night
I agree. I
in the
agree.
dark, right? And I throw one on, and they're not that long, and I watch them all the way through. And I mean, I know what the ends are, but and I've seen them a million times. I can almost quote them, kind of like the Philip Hinchcliffe era of Doctor
Yeah,
Who.
but there's an
Um,
enjoyment there.
Massive enjoyment. I
Mm.
mean, just so, and I obsess over them to some degree.
Hmm. That's
So
very unusual in Doctor Who fans.
yeah, I know. Is that's the great thing about meeting so many great Doctor Who fans over the last few years, is
Hmm.
that you learn that you're not alone.
Yeah.
You're not alone in kind of this weird obsession that you have with it. And it's really this very similar with Holmes, and there are Holmes files all over the world, just like there are Doctor Who people who love Doctor Who all over the world as well. And and we started this conversation by talking about that Venn diagram between the two, and
We've come full circle.
yeah, we
Pardon the
have.
pun.
Yes, no Adric involved though.
Oh
Um,
God.
and the fact of the matter is, we're all very similar. We all have this love of something very, very similar, which is this brilliant person
Hmm.
who uses their brain to solve problems.
Yeah,
Okay,
it's all about
no
their
matter.
intellect.
And it is. It's not about anything else. It's not about anything else. It's about how special their knowledge is, and how they use their special knowledge in order to solve problems.
Hmm.
And I think that the greatest heroes in my life, and I started talking about my father, who
Hmm.
was a great diagnostician over the phone. He was like that in so many ways, when I was growing up, and I looked up to that, and that's what I always wanted to do, was be able to solve problems, to
Hmm.
be that person you come to solve problems. And it shaped how my career, and it shaped my life, and it shaped how I am.
So it's had a
And
long-lasting effect on you.
absolutely, and it continues today, and I still have a deep appreciation for it and still love it.
That comes
Um,
across, obviously, the way you're so passionate about it, you talk about it.
yeah, and I mean, so it becomes a part of you, and when you watch these things, and when you read documentation, when you read the literature.
Hmm.
I'm in IT, so that's all I talk about is documentation. When you read the literature, you're seeing brilliance in front of you,
Hmm.
and some people have some people's heroes are John Wayne, or maybe it's a politician, or maybe it's some other movie actor, or maybe it's a famous person in history, like Martin Luther King or somebody like that, who inspires you to become the person you are.
Yeah.
And even though it is fiction, and all this is fiction, there are real life people who you go to solve problems. And these are the people who are what we would call in IT subject matter experts. These are brilliant people who know how to take the very smallest amount of information and extrapolate that into a solution. And being able to do that, and those skills are something that I have great respect for and I get excited about.
So I'm going to throw you a curveball now, Josh.
Oh, no,
I know.
no curveballs.
So we spent nearly the last hour talking about Holmes. So I'm guessing you've probably done a little bit of research, because as much as you're kind of well versed in it, you're probably a bit like me and you'd want to watch a few episodes of Brett or something. Is there anything else that you've been enjoying at the moment away from Holmes?
Yeah, I mean, you might be shocked to hear this, but I've really gotten into James Bond.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so Skyfall. This has become sort of my newest love, is really diving into the Bond, and it's part of the whole thing around the commentaries we're doing. But I'd never seen them that much, and I really love Skyfall, and I thought. I've seen it actually twice in the theater, which is something I've never ever done, is watched a movie twice in a theater.
It's a great film.
It really is, and it's good for anybody, even just starting out with James Bond. It's a good movie on its own, and I just really enjoyed it. And I love how they've rebooted Bond, and it's interesting that, why wouldn't I like James Bond? You have a 50-year franchise, that's gone through so many different regenerations.
Sounding familiar, yeah.
And is just as popular today as it was back then, if not more so. And you got a guy who has special talents,
Yeah.
And it's just brilliant stuff. So that's kind of where I am right now, is trying to dive in and become more versed in the area of James Bond.
I was talking to someone, I don't know if you've heard of him, called Eric Escamilla. Are you vaguely aware of him?
I've never heard of him.
No.
Is he a good guy?
Yeah, he is actually, yeah. Slightly whimsical at times, but
yes, he is.
He's a good guy, yeah. He was comparing Skyfall with the J.J. Abrams Star Trek movie. Not in terms of plot, but in terms of they're taking all the key factors from a successful franchise from the past, keeping them in, but also updating it enough that it's still relevant to a new audience. And I think he made a really good point there.
Wow, that is quite brilliant. That's surprising. No, I'm just kidding. No, he often does this. He often does this. He does this himself, as he extrapolates one thing into the other, and it works. It's one of the great things about talking to Eric about stuff like this. But it's interesting. I'm just going to tangent off with J.J. Abrams for a minute. He's created a show here, a drama called Person of Interest. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, somebody was recommending that in one of our feedbacks not that long ago.
All right, I'm gonna jump on that. I'm gonna say I'm gonna highly recommend that. Okay. For anyone who appreciates a little bit of crime drama along with a little bit of science fiction attached to it.
Okay.
And I think it's brilliant, and I think it's brilliantly written, and it's brilliantly acted, and I highly recommend that to everybody who enjoys that kind of thing. The combination, a little bit of sci-fi and crime drama. This guy has invented a machine. Basically, this machine was invented after 2001, where it detects whether somebody might be a terrorist. Okay? It uses every camera there is everywhere. And what it does is it finds, everything that you say and everything that you do, it looks for a certain words or certain things around them that would put them either into danger, or they're either the perpetrator or the victim.
Right.
and you don't know what it is, but their number comes up. And you have the guy who invented the machine, and you have this special forces guy who's kind of living under the radar and around, away from the authorities,
Hmm.
who goes in and tries to save these people or stop them from killing somebody else or stop them from doing something wrong. And you don't know if they're the perpetrator or the victim.
That sounds really out there.
it's it is really, really good TV.
Oh, cool. I may have to add that to our rental list.
Do so. Do so.
Sounds a little
Check it
bit like
out.
Minority Report, that kind of being able to analyze or predict the future and try and catch people before they actually do what they're going to do.
Yeah, and it's just, I mean, so the fact that it changes each story, you don't know whether it's the perpetrator or the victim or what the story is, and it makes it more interesting.
That does sound very cool.
It is. It is. There is some good modern stuff out there.
You just got to look for it.
You just got to look for it. That's all. Yeah.
Well, Josh, thank you ever so much for coming onto the show. I really appreciate you taking the time out to come on and chat about Sherlock Holmes.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Mark. I really enjoyed it.
And maybe if there's something else you'd like to have a chat about, you'd like to come back another time.
Well, you know, I'll always chat about Doctor Who. I could do that every day.
Excellent. Right. That's a date. Closing out the show today, this is Mark.
This is Josh.
And even if you're about to take a tumble over Reichenbach Falls,
Don't panic.